This is a recorded presentation for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission's Atlantic Cobia Draft Addendum 2 for public comment. My name is Emily Franca, and I am the Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for Cobia at the Commission. I will provide an overview of the draft addendum, which considers changes to the Cobia recreational allocation, the process for evaluating harvest against targets, and the timeline for setting management measures. I'll start with a brief overview of the Commission, and then I'll review the current recreational management for Cobia before getting into Draft Addendum 2 and the proposed management options. And then at the end, I will review how you can provide public comment. Starting with background on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission itself, the Commission was formed in 1942 as an interstate compact between the 15 Atlantic coast states from Maine down through Florida. And the Commission is a deliberative forum for those states as they are coordinating management for species in state waters, which is 0 to 3 miles from shore. And while each state is represented on the Commission by 3 commissioners, each state gets 1 vote in the decision-making process. Cobia management at the Commission falls under the Coastal Pelagics Management Board, which includes the states from Rhode Island through Florida, with the exception of Connecticut. And the board also includes the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. Note that the Commission manages the Atlantic migratory group Cobia, which occurs from Georgia northward. There is a separate Gulf of Mexico migratory group of Cobia, which does include the east coast of Florida, but that Gulf of Mexico group is not managed by the Commission. So this addendum that I will be talking about only applies to state waters from Georgia northward. So now I will review the current recreational management process for Atlantic Cobia. There are 2 different types of states in the Cobia recreational management process. So first you have Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And these 4 states account for the vast majority of cobia harvest along the Atlantic coast. So these 4 states are held to a minimum size of 40 inches total length or 36 inches fork length. And then the seasons and the vessel limits are determined by each state. And the maximum vessel limit a state can have is 6 fish per vessel. So each of these 4 states has a state-specific harvest target. And then every few years, the state evaluates whether their harvest has been above the target or below the target. And then that determines if the state needs to change their season or their vessel limit to meet their target. And then at the bottom here, the second group of states is referred to as de minimis states. And these are currently states from Maryland northward. So de minimis states have very low harvest, less than 1% each of the coastwide harvest in most of the recent years. So these de minimis states are held to a minimum size of 37 inches total length or 33 inches fork length and a vessel limit of 1 fish. These de minimis states could instead decide to implement the same measures as the state of Virginia, which is the nearest non-de minimis state. So these de minimis states from Maryland northward, they don't have state-specific harvest targets, so there's no evaluations of the state harvest against the target. Instead, a portion of the total quota is set aside to account for harvest in these de minimis states. So here is a visual of how the current recreational management process works for Cobia. The management board can set the total harvest quota for up to 3 years at a time. And then on the left, you can see 1% of the recreational harvest quota is set aside for de minimis states. So right now for those states from Maryland northward, and then 99% of the recreational harvest quota is allocated among Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And the percent that each of those states is allocated is based on landings from 2006 to 2015. So then the allocation percent then determines what the state's target is in terms of number of fish. And then every few years, those 4 states evaluate their average harvest against their target. If their average harvest has been over the target, then the state has to take a reduction to adjust measures to reduce harvest to their target. And if the average harvest has been under the target for 2 consecutive years, then the state has the option to liberalize measures to get up to the target. So the total harvest quota and state recreational measures have been status quo since 2021, and in some states have been status quo for even longer than that. But recreational measures could change in 2025. So there is an evaluation coming up to compare harvest against the targets, and this draft addendum 2 will determine the allocation framework and the state targets for that evaluation for 2025 measures. And then later on, recreational measures might change again in 2026 or 2027 because we have a new stock assessment for Cobia. So that new stock assessment later on might change the total amount of quota, and so that will also change the state targets in 2026 or 2027. So now I'll get into draft addendum 2 specifically. And again, this addendum is focused on recreational allocation, the harvest target evaluation process, and the timeline for setting management measures. So the board started this draft addendum 2 process to address concerns about the current recreational allocation framework. So currently the recreational allocations, so that's the percent that is allocated to each state, is based on landings data from 2006 to 2015. And now there are more recent data available, and the distribution of Cobia landings has changed since 2015. So over the last several years, we've seen that recreational landings have increased in some mid-Atlantic states, while they have remained relatively stable in some of the southern states. So this indicates that the range of Cobia is possibly expanding north. And then additionally, we've had 2 states that have declared into the fishery recently due to increasing cobia in their state waters. So updating the allocation data used would account for these recent changes in landings and the extent of the fishery. So this figure shows cobia recreational harvest in number of fish broken down by state over time. So you can see Georgia is in orange on the bottom, South Carolina in blue, North Carolina in green, Virginia in yellow, and then the de minimis states, those states north of Virginia, are the very thin line in gray at the top. So over the last several years, recreational landings have increased, particularly in Virginia in yellow, which has become the majority of harvest since about 2018. All states seem to have variable landings with some higher years, some lower years, but overall, Virginia's harvest has generally increased in recent years. North Carolina's harvest has generally decreased. And then South Carolina and Georgia's harvests have been relatively stable as compared to previous years. So the Commission uses recreational harvest data from the Marine Recreational Information Program called MRIP, and those state level harvest estimates for cobia tend to have high uncertainty with a high percent standard error. So there are concerns about continuing to use those state data that have high uncertainty to evaluate the performance and to make management decisions at a state level. So one way to reduce that uncertainty is to increase sample size, so increase the area that we're looking at. So this could be accomplished by changing to a regional or a coastwide allocation framework. Uncertainty could also be addressed by considering the number of years included in the averages that are used. Uncertainty could also be addressed by considering whether to use point estimates or a range of estimates, and whether a state or region's performance should be considered by itself or whether the performance of other states or regions should be taken into account when making management decisions. Another concern is that these allocation percentages may need to be updated in the future. So right now the board has to go through a formal addendum process like this process to make any changes, and this could take several months. However, changes could be accomplished more quickly if the board was able to make changes via board action or board vote. And then finally, there is concern about changing management measures too frequently. Right now, the board can set measures for up to 3 years at a time, but to avoid management whiplash or changing measures too frequently, the board could consider setting measures for a longer period of time. So to address all of these concerns, the board initiated Draft Addendum 2 back in October of last year. The draft addendum was then developed and the board approved the draft addendum for public comment in May. So we are currently in the public comment period, which runs through July 8th. And then in August, the board will review public comments and select final management options for this addendum, which will impact the recreational measures for next year, 2025 and beyond. So the board has several management options to choose from in this draft addendum, and there are 5 sets of options. So I'll review each of the sections here. The first section is on recreational allocation, which is the bulk of the addendum, and then the other 4 sections are more process related for how to update future allocations, how to evaluate landings against the targets, and the timeline for setting measures. So starting with the recreational allocation, section 3.1. So this section considers how to allocate the Cobia recreational quota. So either on a state-by-state basis, a regional basis, or a coast-wide basis. This section also considers what data timeframe to use as a basis for allocation. So what harvest data to use to determine what percent each state or region would get. So status quo, the current allocation system uses a weighted average of landings from 2006 to 2015 and 2011 to 2015. So to consider more recent data, there are options using only the most recent 6 years of data, so using data from 2018 to 2023. For this time span, data from 2020 is excluded due to the COVID-19 impacts on sampling. So this 2018 to 2023 would use 5 years of data going back a total of 6 years. And then another option is this third time frame here, using a combination of data going back 10 years to 2014, combined with the most recent 6 years of data from 2018 to 2023. So again, 2020 would be excluded because of those COVID-19 impacts, and then 2016 and 2017 would also be excluded due to fishery closures during those years. So this last one would be 7 years of data going back 10 years. So for the options themselves, options A and B would be state-by-state allocations with the state-specific targets like we have now and the state-specific management measures. So option A is the status quo state-by-state allocation using the older data. And then option B would consider using the more recent data for each state. And option B would also increase the amount of quota that's set aside to account for landings in those northern de minimis states. So this table shows those state-by-state allocation options. The first column is option A, status quo, based on the older data. So you can see 1% is currently set aside for the northern de minimis states. Virginia gets about 39%, North Carolina about 38%, South Carolina about 12%, and Georgia about 9%. So under options B1 and B2, which are using the more recent data, you can see that the amount of quota set aside for the northern de minimis states would increase to about 5%. And then you see that more quota would be shifted to Virginia based on the more recent harvest trends from the last several years. So under options B1 or B2, Virginia would get between 64 to 69% of the quota. North Carolina would have between 13 to 17% of the quota. South Carolina would have between 6 to 7% of the quota, and Georgia would have about 6% of the quota. So instead of state-by-state allocations, the next option would be a regional allocation. So option C. So this option would allocate the quota by region using the more recent harvest data. So with a regional allocation, the goal is to eventually establish a consistent size and vessel limit for all states that are in the same region to meet the regional target. Seasons can still be different among states. So the next time a reduction is needed to meet the target or after the next stock assessment, all states in a region would have to coordinate to determine what the consistent regional measures would be to meet the regional target. So here is the table of regional allocation options. You can see the first set of options on top, C1 and C2, would have a northern region of Rhode Island through North Carolina and a southern region of South Carolina through Georgia. So option C1 uses the most recent 6 years of data only, and then C2 uses the combined most recent 6 years plus the most recent 10 years. So here, this northern region of Rhode Island through Virginia would get between 86 to 87% of the quota, and then South Carolina and Georgia would get about 12 to 13% of the quota. And then for the bottom set of options, C3 and C4, the region split would be different. So the northern region would be Rhode Island through Virginia, and the North Carolina would be in the southern region with South Carolina and Georgia. So here, the northern region would get between 68 to 73% of the quota, and the southern region, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, would get between 26 to 31% of the quota. So the final option for how to allocate the recreational quota is a coastwide target. So this is option D. So this means that there wouldn't be any state or regional allocation. All the states from Georgia northward would have to eventually have the same size and vessel limit working toward that coastwide target. So the next time a reduction is needed or after the next stock assessment, all the states along the coast would coordinate to have the same size and vessel limits, but the states could still have different seasons to meet the coastwide target. So that wraps up that first section, 3.1 on allocation. The next section, 3.2, is on future updates to allocation. So currently, status quo option A, allocations can only be changed through the formal addendum or amendment process. Alternatively here, option B, the board could make changes to the allocation percentages by taking board action, which is a board vote, only under two very specific scenarios. So one scenario is if you have a northern state that starts harvesting over the de minimis threshold, and then they need to be added into the allocation and get their own harvest target, the board could vote to update the allocation calculations to account for that new state. The other scenario is if the MRIP data used for the allocations is revised, the board could vote to update the allocations to use that revised data. So the next section, 3.3, is on data and uncertainty. So status quo option A, currently up to 3 years of landings data are averaged to compare against the target during the evaluation process. Alternatively, option B would allow up to 5 years of landings data to be used in the evaluation process. So these extra years of data could be helpful since Cobia landings vary from year to year and have high uncertainty. So if the board does choose a regional or coastwide allocation, the board could vote in the future to switch from using an average approach to using a confidence interval approach for these evaluations. So confidence intervals would more directly account for uncertainty by looking at a range of harvest for each year instead of just the average of point estimates. So here on the screen on the left, you can see the point estimates for 3 years. So under the average approach, those points would be averaged, and that average would be compared to the target. On the right, you can see confidence intervals, which gives us a range of what the harvest might be for a given year. So the board could determine whether the target falls within that range each year instead of just using the point estimate. So the next section is 3.4, which is the overage response for landings evaluations. And currently, status quo option A, if a state or region's average is above their target, that state or region must change their measures to reduce harvest to meet their target. Alternatively, option B, for performance comparisons, if a state or a region is above their target, they may not need to take a reduction if 2 criteria are met. So if another state or region is below their target by the same amount, and if the coastwide harvest is not over the target, that state that's over may not have to take a reduction. So if these 2 criteria are met, then a state that's over their target may not need to take a reduction. And then the last section is 3.5, which is the timeline for setting management measures. So currently, status quo option A, the board can set management measures for up to 3 years at a time. Alternatively, option B, the board could set measures for up to 5 years at a time. So this would reduce how often management measures are changed, and this would align with when new stock assessment information is available, which typically has been about every 5 to 6 years. So that wraps up all the management options in this draft addendum. These options are open for public comment, and here is how you can provide comments. So the draft addendum 2 document is posted on the Commission's website on the public input webpage. And then all the public hearings are listed on the Commission's online calendar. There are 4 in-person hearings in early June, and then there are 3 virtual webinar hearings in late June. And you can submit written comments until 11:59 p.m. on July 8th, 2024. You can submit those written comments via email by sending them to comments@asmfc.org using the subject line Cobia Draft Addendum 2, or you can send in written comments via mail to the address of the Commission listed here on the screen. And all of this information is listed on the website and also in the Draft Addendum 2 document itself.